Hello, everybody. This is Brian Tenty, and this is The Weight of Lies Hidden Truths of Obesity, a new series that I'm starting. Part one of this series is the morbidity of obesity, and as with all parts in this series, this video will make some shocking claims, so I will be going through a full round of disclaimers. This presentation is not intended as a substitute for the medical advice of doctors. Individuals on medications or with medical conditions should consult a doctor before making any changes. The reader should regularly consult a doctor in matters relating to his or her health, in particular with respect to any symptoms that may require diagnosis or medical attention. The author disclaims any liability, loss, or risk incurred as a consequence, directly or indirectly, of the use and application of any of the contents of this presentation. The viewer assumes all risks associated with the use of this presentation. The next disclaimers are general disclaimers for content. These are disclaimers of non-endorsement, non-liability. Please pause the video and take time to read through them if you are not familiar with these clauses. If you're not already familiar with some of my content and me, I am not a doctor or any other licensed health professional. I have researched extensively diet, nutrition, and health studies since 2011, and there are a lot of numerous advanced topics I've studied as well, not included in mainstream discussion like angiogenesis, epigenetics, and hormonal impacts on body composition. I've written several ebooks, self-published ebooks on diet, nutrition, and health topics, and I have a small amount of content on my YouTube channel, The Health Story Project. But the most popular videos, around 200,000 views, are more focused on amateur competitive eating and not my research. The Weight of Lies on Obesity claims that the truth about the causes of obesity and the obesity epidemic have been purposely suppressed to drive corporate profits in the food, medical, and pharmaceutical industries, and that these lies cause significant financial burden, reduce quality of life, create emotional and physical stress, cause upwards of 2 million lives per year in the United States alone, and put future generations around the globe at significant health risk. The goals of this series is to expose all the secondary information available in health data and studies to provide answers where academia has failed, to expose critical truths academia is willfully misrepresenting or failing to directly research critical topics, to find solutions to obesity by utilizing all the health data available, including global health data, to support new and existing claims. In part one, morbidity of obesity, we're going to talk about mainly these 5 topics with profit over people, censorship, obesity as a cause of death, global trends in obesity and health factors, then the mortality risk of smoking versus obesity. These are several of the presented claims that will be supported. Obesity is far more deadly than mainstream information claims. Obesity takes as much as 50 years or 40% plus off of life expectancy. Obesity is not a primary driver of type 2 diabetes, and obesity is far more significant cause of death than type 2 diabetes. Obesity is far more deadly than smoking, and the data exposing these profound hidden truths is being purposely misrepresented, suppressed, and or censored. Profits over people, tobacco, opioids, and obesity. The Surgeon General's warning for tobacco was only about 50 years ago. So, congressional hearings started around 1954 to investigate the safety of tobacco as well as the tobacco industry's knowledge of any harmful effects prior to any public dissemination. And so, yeah, and they're continuing to this day, even. And a lot of people don't know as well is that the first major sponsor of the tobacco industry was the American Medical Association. So tobacco has had a partnership for a long time with the medical industry. Tobacco industry leaders aim to make tobacco products more addictive, and this includes marketing appeal to children as well as manipulating nicotine levels and other chemical additives. And that brings us right away to our first hidden truths section in this video and this series. So to explain a little bit, these hidden truths are going to be, data that is evident, of significance that is, you can infer from between the lines or through combining this data with other studies when it's not available directly. So already we've got a main hidden truth to recognize, which the tobacco industry had already done sufficient research to prove with statistical significance both that tobacco uses caused life-threatening health effects and that tobacco was addictive. So they already knew this prior, so they were denying it. They knew it by the 50s already when it was still not publicly disclosed and the congressional hearings started. The tobacco industry was using research to make nicotine more addictive and using marketing research to increase sales, including appeal to children for future tobacco users. So, a huge center and example of profits over people. And the research was being done by experts, including doctors and other health professionals, and no one spoke up for decades. Smoking did get a lot of attention in the 1950s, but there were other doctors and researchers that were concerned for decades before that. So the obesity epidemic started in the same time period as the Surgeon General's warnings and consequential congressional hearings, where they actually took action, they took taxes, and they were held to be, to at least have some accountability. Philip Morris already owned a food label at that time and later on went to purchase Kraft in 1988. Winston-Salem had changed to R.J. Reynolds and then acquired Nabisco, becoming RJR Nabisco. And that acquisition was right around the same time Philip Morris purchased Kraft, with the Nabisco being between 1985 and 1986. Then RJR Nabisco is now part of Mondelez International, which is the largest food conglomerate, and Procter and Gamble had interests in both cigarette production and medicine to aid health issues related to tobacco, and that continues to this day. At a glance, the transition from cigarettes to food might seem a little bit off, but it's really a transition from nicotine to food addiction. And regarding food, sugar is more addictive than tobacco, alcohol, and even cocaine. Um, Salt, Sugar, Fat, How the Giants Hooked Us by Michael Moss. He details Howard Moskowitz's work, pioneering how to manipulate flavor and food options, and it is a great read. It really explains a lot, particularly about fast food and processed foods and why America, particularly compared to others, have more salt and sugar and fat. Great book. I recommend checking that out. Going back to nicotine to food addiction, smoking was heavily taxed while commodity crops and processed foods were subsidized, making it a cheaper material to work with effectively. Former smokers tend to overeat, so they were going right from one addiction if they lost customers in tobacco to having the industry to support kind of coping with that, and the behaviors from that transition and cause overeating in former smokers. The food, medical, pharmaceutical, chemical, and agricultural industries all have overlapping profit interests, and the FDA is a common regulatory industry for all industries. So they had already had relationships. They'd already started having people and experts that were going back and forth between government and corporate business. So they already had a place, and the main place that they needed to for having some sort of influence on policy and regulations as well. As the tobacco giants transition to food giants, we had, you saw this big demonized tobacco and healthy at any weight kind of campaign mentality. So Food addiction requires all the same tactics, strategies, corporate ties, and government agencies that tobacco used. But tobacco now being exposed, uh, food addiction got the benefit of having something to demonize and stigmatize. So that became tobacco. So all the negativity and mortality and research is really focused as tobacco being more deadly than any other risk factor. So it's a target for public attention and a scapegoat for preventable death. Data on obesity and risk factors of excess body fat was practically non-existent at the time, so it was more easy to manipulate, and eating is allowed almost everywhere. So discussing weight even was, became body shaming, while excessive body fat was positively stigmatized as healthy at any weight. And that whole healthy at any weight notion is pretty much nonsense because there is a lot of correlation, especially now, with the effects of mortality rate on even people that were formerly overweight or formerly obese. So, there's no data to support health, the notion or perspective of healthy at any weight. Overeating to the point of obesity is not considered food addiction or any other eating disorder, right? So, smoking, is really shunned and is considered, something that's unhealthy and is and highly addictive. But hey, if you can't stop eating because you're conditioning yourself and regularly, having that reward and pleasure of all these foods that we know can impact our health, that, I mean, that is an eating disorder. That is a food addiction. And there's a lot of people that talk about their experiences and their personal struggles, how they want to eat so much and they're so embarrassed that, they'll go to drive-throughs and hide it from their family. So yeah, tobacco as the scapegoat here, while people looked away and people normalized uh healthy at any. So I know it's really difficult, to think that there's any coordination, particularly, with professions like doctors, that we need to be able to trust to, be looking out for the public interest of, of health. But we've got more current proof that, that doesn't happen nearly as much as we think, and profits over people is more of a driver, than public health factors. So, truth in court that's been exposed with the opioid epidemic, OxyContin was known to be highly addictive and should have been used in only the most severe of cases for pain. Purdue Pharmaceuticals worked with doctors, insurance companies, and others to make OxyContin more available and widely prescribed. And Purdue Pharmaceuticals was motivated to increase profits by OxyContin's addictiveness. Other truths exposed by the opioid epidemic, include that the processes at the FDA failed to catch the deadliest prescription pill ever made. And the FDA has failed to acknowledge its full responsibility in the opioid epidemic. The FDA had even approved modifications to the drug to claim it was abuse proof, and that's just ridiculous. I know they made a gel and they did some other, modifications, but one of them included being crush resistance. And it's like, look, even with all these, you can get addicted, you can increase your dosage more and more and more. It's like, it's never going to stop abuse, period. But even if something is harder to crush, that doesn't stop anyone who wants to crush a pill from just spending more time crushing it. It really, again, the entire notion that the claims could be made it was abuse proof, just absolutely ridiculous. And the FDA has not made any major changes aimed at preventing another health epidemic caused by the products it's responsible for determining as safe. So there's been no real big changes, and that to me, for one, is enough to cause a good amount of skepticism towards their intentions of profit over people. And here are some really frightening questions we have to ask ourselves in this whole history. Is new drugs can get recalled quickly? Why didn't OxyContin? Competing pharmaceutical companies have interest in exposing dangers of competitive products. Why didn't they say anything? Doctors, police, morticians, and government agencies must have seen signs earlier. Why didn't they say anything? When those addicted to Oxycontin switched to heroin, why was this data used to keep Oxycontin on the market, right? It was used to say, oh, hey, well, we've got, there's less addiction because, less people are abusing it and these prescription datas and yada, yada, yada. But, they knew that people were going to other opioids, particularly heroin in these cases. And that is further evidence of the addiction and reason to pull it off the market and restrict it further. But the data was used to support the opposite. And why was it not called the OxyContin crisis, right? Even when there is a current crisis, the fentanyl crisis, called by name. It's because of how influential Purdue Pharmaceuticals and OxyContin were in the industry, and shows how much influence that they had in controlling, the narrative. Obesity is actually deadlier than tobacco and opioids combined. And the reason why this isn't more well known, is multifold. And so, first off, obesity as a cause of death is suppressed more fervently than tobacco and opioids in terms of research and studies. Studies showing high mortality from tobacco and or opioids are not ardently attacked, but the data in clinical peer-reviewed studies that prove beyond doubt obesity is more fatal than smoking, they are. Um, or it was even not to that extent. It was approaching or on a trend where obesity would overtake smoking as the leading cause of preventable death. Leading causes of death caused by obesity, such as heart disease, cancer, and stroke, are all the blame instead of obesity. And there's some precedence here because death from prescription pills, even when used properly, are all counted as accidental, right? So there is really this hiding of information or suppressing of information, and I know it's under guise of other reasons, but that suppress some of the safety risks of consumer products. Um, and consumers mostly presume food is safe and obesity is temporary, unknowingly putting them at risk. And that's the big deal here. This is a quote from Mike Moore with the in his School of Business, Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, from the discussion on if conflict of interest between business and different health factors for public interest. Cigarettes are something that individuals consume of their own free will with full knowledge of the consequences. If a company responds to their desire to smoke cigarettes, that's the way the market works, and that's the way it should work, right? But what if the public does not know, just like with obesity, how much harm it is doing and it is not exposed yet? And that's where we find ourselves today. We find ourselves repeating history. The public isn't aware of the health risks they presume would have already been identified by medical and or government agencies such as the American Medical Association and Food and Drug Administration. The top 10 food conglomerates control over 80% of the food available in typical American grocery stores. Two current food giants formerly owned by tobacco giants. Almost all other food giants are now owned and controlled by the financial industry with the sole motive of profit and increasing, um, and benefiting their shareholders. Partnerships with the medical industry and lobbyists used to control information and awareness. They already existed and they've been used and leveraged and improved on, after the experiences with tobacco and even opioids. And most research is now funded by the same corporations profiting off of the diseases they are thought to be curing. But of course, there are huge profit motives in anyone working on chronic illness and disease and health factors to, favor treatment for profits over cures. Continuing with profits over people, we're going to focus a bit more on censorship right now. I will talk a bit more about censorship later on, um, but this is kind of the introduction to hopefully make the public aware of how much data can be suppressed and misrepresented and how affluent it is now, and has been for decades. So researchers and academics, have this term, this loose term, and it's often referred to as inconvenient findings, right? So what does that mean? It is a term used to cover the asses of researchers with enough integrity not to hide research, but not enough they're willing to directly confront corporate profits. So it's really any finding that threatens a major corporate interest. um, Backlash and retaliation are not part of scientific criticism, no matter how harsh that criticism is, right? So, in terms of backlash, you're talking about like pressure to not publish the study, threats or actions to terminate employment, and other types of non-scientific, criticism, smear campaigns, slandering, and things of the such. Dr. Asim Malhotra, a cardiologist in Europe, recently discussed his experiences on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, 1979. And the question, when you hear his story and other stories, as we'll be discussing, is of all the times people are coming forward and they have enough integrity to at least, again, maybe not directly go against what's happening from who they're being pressured by, but again, still having enough integrity that they're not just going to blatantly hide the data or not submit the study. But how many times do the threats of backlash work? How many times do they not even have to be said? Like researchers won't even pose a thesis that they know could or has a potential to have an inconvenient finding, right? So for every case that we hear, that there are many and many examples how that threat and that retaliation for inconvenience findings is working. In inconvenient findings, we have the case of inconvenient deaths. So Dr. Catherine M. Flagel and her work on determining of the mortality risk of obesity is a really clear and great example. So there was a 2004 study published in JAMA that concluded approximately 400,000 deaths in America are caused by poor diet and physical inactivity, aka obesity, not necessarily directly, but that would include more people who are, more overweight. But at any rate, for all intents and purposes, obesity. A 2005 study published by Flagel concluded only around 112,000 deaths in America were caused by obesity. So it turned out that the work in the 2004 study was ongoing when Flagel started her research, and she didn't know it when she became aware of it. um, she experiences backlash and she learned a whole lot about the context and why. But there was a ton of backlash because she did not reduce that number even further. Flagel's experiences include over 30 years of work in the CDC and has published many more studies on the mortality risk of obesity in America. But she wrote a tell-all that we're about to discuss. In Dr. Flagel's article accounting her experiences and backlash for her work on obesity and its mortality risk, published in 2021 in Science Direct. She writes, "At first I was startled, but eventually I came to expect partisan attacks masquerading as scientific concerns. I had expected some modest interest in our findings, pursued through normal channels of scientific discussion. I had not expected an aggressive campaign that includes insults, errors, misinformation, behind the scenes gossips and maneuvers, social media posts, and even complaints to my employer. Many more instances that have space to describe here. It seemed that some felt that our work should be judged not on its merits, but rather on whether its findings supported the goals and objectives of the interlocutors. I saw firsthand the antagonism that can be provoked by inconvenient scientific findings. And that brings us to inconvenient causes, when the cause of death would expose consumer safety issues and health risks that would have the potential to threaten profits. Prescription drug death, even if proper use, excluding suicide, is categorized as accidental. And this itself shows clear intent and precedent that's set before it to hide the risk of death from FDA approved medications. Toxicology reports are private, even though death by consumer products is clearly a public interest. I mean, they definitely could at least gather the data anonymously so it's not exposing directly, private or HIPAA information. Uh, there is both national and global attention on causes of death, killing far less people every year. That must be stopped. So these already have public outroar. So we've got illegal drug use, DUIs, suicide, etc. And none of these areas threaten corporate profits. And they're all great areas. And I'm not trying to downplay the attention that they deserve. It's just that they're allowed to have that public outroar because they don't have any threat to public interest here. All right. So even though this information is, not mainstream, and Dr. Flagel's backlash was because she didn't reduce um, the mortality risk of obesity even further than she did, and it's still highly misrepresented. The only reason why I can make these claims, obviously, is because there are sources of truth to reveal the true morbidity and mortality risk of obesity. So this is where we're going to start looking at the data to support the claims. The first big piece of data that really stood out to me to as a source of truth to the morbidity of obesity is what I call the death curve. So it's obesity or disease burden associated by age. Um, and here is some data with for approximately 4-year age increments from a Gallup poll um, on the rate of obesity, the prevalence of obesity by age group. And so you see right here first, right, there's this really big, kind of a dip to the curve. It starts to level out. But obesity is a disease that builds over time, which means that this should really continue to be growing. Therefore, any uh, any gap between that expectation would be directly death directly caused by obesity. So, right, so you expect it to look more like this, right? So we can see that we've got a big hit to mortality starting around 35, and it significantly changes and drops after 60 years of age. So as a counterpoint and rebuttal, people may say as people age, they take better care of their diet and health, leading to reversing obesity. And easily rebuttal here, obesity is, for all intents and purposes, non-reversible, with 70% to 100% of all weight loss regained between a 100 to 5-year period. This is something we see all the time, and why obesity, another example how obesity and its severity is being downplayed, right? So no country has found a solution to reversing obesity or childhood obesity for that matter. Activity levels typically decline dramatically as people age. So, while the most active age group has the sharpest rises in obesity, right? So you see this really sharp rise when we're supposed to be very youthful and very active, but yet on this down curve, we see this sudden decline in obesity, right? And that counters all the theoretical support, especially when driven by excess caloric intake and reduced by activity. Obesity associated by age group, was a lot more common, from 2010, and previously. But you still see a lot of United States research on obesity with, polls and groups and studies by age group. And when looking at ethnicity, one of the really interesting things you see is it's got, the same curve for these, different ethnic groups. Yet, it really stands out that the Asian American community, um, has um, a completely different rate of obesity, right? And so you see this very low straight line here, and once again up top, you see the national average, and you see, this the general curve that we saw, um, looking at obesity as a whole. So, looking at life expectancy, I also knew that this had some correlation with life expectancy, and that's what you would expect. So, if obesity is indeed a major cause of mortality, or a primary cause of mortality other than what is currently being listed as the primary factors, we'd expect to see association and trends with longevity, as well. And you do. Um, Asians, not only in America, have longer lifespans, but this also trends with obesity data between the United States and Japan, China, and other Asian countries as a whole. All right, so here are some global trends comparing obesity in the United States and Japan to the life expectancy in the United States and Japan. So there's very, very interesting notes. We do see increases in general. There were a lot of advancements in medical technology, so there were some, pretty big improvements in the 1970s and 80s. So that's all good there. But yeah, we see, to note that there's this widening gap, and even though there may not be as much of a direct trend, and it would need some different working variables here, we see that there's a widening trend between life expectancy in Japan and the United States. And one of the scary things we also have to ask here too is the United States is still dropping while Japan is increasing. So with the Asian American, ethnicity data with obesity, it's like in these trends, we could say that, hey, maybe 10% or below is some sort of significant marker where we see it affect demographics more and more and more. And that was when the obesity epidemic has really started, when America hit around 13% in 1970. So these are very important details that should be noted as well. And to further support the theory that these trends apply to these particular demographics when they're categorized correctly, you should expect to see the same type of relationships in global trends and, association by age group, and you see the same exact trends. So, for those not familiar with SDI, it's the socio-demographic index. It's a measure of factors that are normally associated with health, and these include, like, availability to medicine and medical facilities, rates of insurance and medical coverage, income, employment, education, things of the such, and is generalized again by what they call the SDI. So SDI is absolutely a valid and important control variable in obesity trends. And right here, you'll see nationally, these are grouped by SDI from global data. The study that this is pulled from includes 195 countries, surveying, up to, or right about 70 million people. So it's a huge study, and we see the exact same trends. Now, the information that's prior to adulthood, so it's going to be right around here. The 18-year-old category, that wasn't included. So really, you're seeing the same trend here, the same graph, that same death curve starting around 30 to 40 years of age when we look globally. with a sharp decline right around 60 years old. So we see that, and we also see the global impact and trends of obesity over to the other side here with countries, and countries normally are associated with lower SDI, like Colombia, Mexico, Chile, compared to like Australia, Brazil, Germany. You'll see that there are trends in some relationships there that obviously reflect that SDI, is a factor as well. So, all right, so global trends do support and provide a lot of evidence that, this data and these trends that we can establish between particular demographics could be applied a lot more widespread, and we can have a lot more data available to us. With a lot of data, you should expect more hidden truths. And so here we go. Hidden truth number two, there is a major hereditary driver of obesity. Now, besides the evidence that we just have seen at ethnicity trends, and it spans between, specifically looking at data between Asian Americans in the United States and Japan, that there are the same trends in both places, and over time. So clinical studies have shown for decades the impact of diet during gestation and ethnicity on risk of obesity. So these studies have been done. A lot of studies were done on, for example, with during periods of war and famine, and its impact of malnutrition on birth weight, as well as its what type of risks that birth weight carries with both low birth weights and high birth weights. High birth weights being specifically studied, noting that it's associated with children having obesity in both childhood and adulthood. So there's new studies on childhood obesity that confirm that ethnicity and or gestational factors are primary causes of childhood obesity. And with that hidden truth exposed, we get to 2.1. Any study on obesity, including weight gain and weight loss, must account for known factors, including gender, birth year, ethnicity, and socioeconomic index, or I should say here, SDI, sociodemographic index. There's no study I've ever seen that accounts for all factors, and general diet studies rarely account for any of these factors except gender. And we can see that these are crucial to trends in obesity and should be presumed without any contrary evidence that these are critical factors in making sense of weight gain and weight loss changes in general. Hidden truth number three, rates of diseases and health impacts associated with obesity should be expected to show common trends spanning cultures and countries when properly controlled by factors including SDI and ethnicity. So I know that was specifically mentioned before, but there's a lot of other details here and what this then exposes. So let's discuss 3.1. Food itself is the original, now secondary driver of obesity. So something, right? So besides ethnicity, heretics, DNA, epigenetics, besides, factoring all those out, something else has to kick this off. And the only other common thing at the base, is the food itself. So this is going to include more than just, the ultra processed foods, fast foods, and things of the such. But it's the food itself. So we'll have to, that will be dug into much later when we start examining, that topic. Um, Hidden truth 3.2, differences in trends by demographics compared to global trends are of significant importance to isolate root causes, right? So if there's some sort of dramatic shift in what one country or one demographic has done that, either caused some sort of particular unpredicted or unknown worsening of health factors, or, if there was a particular event where you saw dramatic changes in either obesity or childhood obesity, that we should be able to use those to identify what countries did things that work, and leverage that information to identify those events so that we can use those as solutions for everybody else. Going back to continued support for the death curve, so the presumption is, again, we haven't looked at the data, but the hidden truth is that these trends should span other correlated health diseases with obesity and health risk factors, they should also span and see trends, globally between these ethnicity groups. And so I did know that Asian Americans and all Americans still have high rates of diabetes, as you see here in the graph on the left. Right, so this is the United States. Now, Asian non-Hispanic, Americans that are a little bit, they see a little bit of advantage. So you can think, oh, hey, there's some small advantage here, but not really. If you look at, if you look at countries, so I think it's specifically Asian Pacific Islands to include Japan. But if you look at China, Japan, these are the same rates. I am showing rates here for Japan. They've done some good studies that are done fairly recently with a lot of data well broken down. So the thing that you can see here is Japan. If you didn't know, they have very low obesity rates. So prior to 1970, it was less than 4%. I think even just a few percent, and now it's still slowly trending up. And I think it latest was around 6 or 4%, something like that. So they have very low obesity rates, but still, even in Japan, they have very high rates of type 2 diabetes. And the reason why diabetes is such an important, data point, and item to look at is data on diabetes, particularly by age group and impacts, have been more widely studied, and the data is more widely available in both the U.S. and in global studies. So it's also something that's because it's measured so quickly and there's so much data available, we could possibly, get a lot of information from, and we absolutely do. So here, what you're seeing is diabetes prevalence trending by age, consistent in both America and Japan. And of course, we're looking for data that we can put in association by age group. So here's some of that breakdown for diabetes prevalence, and on the left, this is female diabetes rates in America. Um, and the male, oh yeah, the trends, or the male actually is on the x-axis. Of just kind of now noticing, as you see, it's like it's continually trending up across age. You see it very plainly by the color groupings over here, with the older communities getting heavily and heavily more diabetic, and lower levels as you scale down in age. So over here, when we're looking at the data from Japan, you're going to see that uh, for men, we see the same relationships over here. Now, this is 2012 data that it's using, so we can see the same relationship, that those that are older have more likelihood to be type 2 diabetic. So the really, really interesting thing with this graph, though, that I have not fully researched yet, is what happened here. All right. Now, it doesn't provide a whole lot of information when you see data split between men and women, but obviously there was some sort of major event that was either exposed or started around the 1990 period in Japan, that really dramatically raised diabetes rates. So I'd be curious if there's any data further down in there. But the whole point here is to show that the diabetes prevalence trending by age is consistent in America and Japan as well. Looking back at this trend by age group, um, to our original death curve, we get some hugely valuable information because, again, food as a common cause. If food and lifestyle factors that are effectively, or that could be, that we should, at least for now, presume could be independent of obesity and type diabetes, right? If we look at them and their associations, if those lifestyle factors continues, it would be supposed that we're going to see the same rise in prevalence across age groups, in the case it was not that it did not carry that high of a risk of mortality. And again, we do not see that. The obesity, this curve, that we can kind of project earlier, we can determine that this area all in here obesity is going to be not just the top underlying factor of cause of death or risk factor as a cause of death, but mostly a cause of mortality itself. Because without obesity, again, you should see a lot more people who become obese, over time. And kind of combining the talking point between these slides and the initial point that there's not a relationship between lifestyle factors, and age here causing the decline of obesity, but it also means that lifestyle factors in general may not have much impact on obesity, and we're going to see that as well. And they tend not to improve with age, so any improvements there are going to be an impact of obesity and other health factors, not necessarily a sign that something is improving. With all this data clearly evident and widely available, I do think it is pretty shocking that this isn't this doesn't have a lot more attention and public interest. Uh, so, and it's hard to believe how much impact it can have, but fortunately, there's a 2018 study in JAMA that's looking at the obese, the mortality risk of not just a normal weight compared to BMI groups, but normal weight compared to formerly overweight and formerly obese individuals. And that's what we're going to see on the left here. And so the health impact from history of obesity, it's never presumed to be erased by weight loss. So this should kind of be a given, notably with heart disease and cancer, top two killers throughout first world countries, right? And theoretically and clinically proven, we know exactly the underlying health, mechanics, and we have the clinical results to prove that no, obesity does have long-term health impact. We already use history with smoking and family history, and they're continually used as risk factors. So we know that history, does impact everything, but obesity history is still not being accounted for. And this is one of the first studies I've seen addressing it. Uh, but from these numbers, we see that there is a 167% increased risk in mortality, or sorry, risk. So a 60% increase in risk in mortality from just the history of being overweight. So you lose, even if you lose the weight, that's just showing that just that history alone increases risk. And this study isn't even looking at how much time that risk is built up. So there's got to be a difference, for example, if you are overweight or obese with a 5-year period versus like a 20-year period. So, and almost 70% of adults in America are overweight or obese, which and almost 40% of the world population. So this mortality risk across the entire world population and all demographics is pure frightening. With all this data and support that obesity carries a major mortality risk, then I figured we should be able to come up with some sort of formula, although admittedly very rough, to iteratively calculate life expectancy for the obese population. So, note for precedence here, this data is already set in a way with the variable being reaching the age of 85. If you reach the or sorry reaching the age of 65, if you reach the age of 65, you have a much greater life expectancy. And on that note, morbidly obese and those with long-term obesity are not likely to live past 65. So this already hints that there could be a really big spread between um, obesity's impact on longevity. So the formula is presuming that obesity is a primary cause of death, independent of other risk factors. And no current studies have analyzed this possibility, not as a risk factor, not as a cause of death. It's always presumed that, obesity is much less a risk factor than smoking, diabetes, and others. Just has more prevalence. Um, So there's an expectation, if this were true and it were a primary cause, to see a predicted life expectancy between 35 years of age and 60 years of age, right? So these are the big slope changes in the death curve, and the demographics that we can use are the input between United States Asians and the combined white, black, and Hispanic demographics in the United States. So the data on age groups has been separated that and continues to be available. And keeping it within the United States for now reduces the impact of SDI factors. We can absolutely apply this to other countries. And get some real good data here, but we'd have to properly account for SDI factors, and that's something where there's a lot of work to do to put all that data together. So this will be the first, kind of rough formula that we're using. All right, so we still got the formula on the left, but we're going to plug in the numbers and look at the data on the right. So if we sub in the demographics for Asian Americans and the white, black, and Hispanic Americans, we've got a 13% obesity rate in 2021. And a life expectancy of 83.5. That did have a slight decline, as was shown in one of the charts from the life expectancy uh, discussion earlier. And so if we go to white, black, and Hispanic Americans, again, also with a slight decline, we see that there's roughly uh, there's a 30% prevalence of obesity and a lifespan of difference of 75 years. Already we can see that, just like we saw with Japan, that there is that gap according to obesity. I solved Italy using ChatGPT, and we get a life expectancy of obesity at 40 and a life expectancy of the non-obese of 94. And this life expectancy for obesity does fall between the expected values, and will put mean age of death close to the mean age between 18 years of age and 60 years of age. And that also agrees with the sharp decline and the lack of prevalence of especially severe morbidity and long history of obesity after that point of age. There are obviously shortcomings of this predicted longevity. Number one, it appears too dramatic. I mean, that would definitely raise the alarm bells. I'm not saying it isn't accurate or won't be close to truth. I'm just saying that, that amount of discrepancy between the truth and mainstream claims would be hard to accept for a lot of people. There's no controls for SDI even within this information, which we know is a impact, uh, to mortality. There's no controls for differentiating obesity as an underlying cause, right? So there's still going to be cases where obesity is an underlying cause, not the primary. Particularly at older ages, so we don't have that. And there's no direct data available, from foreign countries, and that's with my current efforts and research, the data may indeed be available, but I'm not even familiar enough with the lack of familiarity with the I have a lack of familiarity with the demographics and SDI factors within countries, so that if I were to organize this data and to run more formulas, it would be appropriate. I mean, I'm well aware with the socioeconomic disparity in America between these groups, but yeah, I could not do the same thing and make sure that I'm combining groups that indeed have the common SDI factors when processing the data. So those are definitely shortcomings of this projected longevity. Even with shortcomings, it doesn't mean we can't validate the predicted longevity. So let's look at what information we can use if we do want to make sense of this and see if this is at least a reasonable number, right? Smoking is widely accepted and agreed to be a morbidity or comorbidity, contributing to around 500,000 deaths per year in the United States. Mortality rates of smoking have over 50 years of data and is continuing to be studied, and mortality rates include categorization by former smokers. All right. So, 2018 study analyzing mortality of former weight classification could be used to compare against mortality rates of former smokers. So, you know, um, we could kind of calculate and predict uh, obesity's mortality risk factor if we consider that, hey, these associations like are relevant, can be made in categorization of increase in risk, and how it applies to the general population. So obesity as a contribution to morbidity could be estimated calculating the risk factors as factor of mortality rates between the two. And we indeed have that information, here to make those comparisons. So what you're going to see here is again, we'll generalize it as a risk category being a baseline, a moderate, and a heavy. So in the mentioned 2018 study, we've got our baseline is never exceeded, normal weight. And of course, that can be associated with, the data over here, which is going to be the lifelong never smokers, right? So you also see that we've got um, the risk factors for former smokers, and this is the risk factors for current smokers. All these numbers adjusted in 1,000 person hours. So the information that would best map these categories isn't directly available. So, to further discuss in detail these categories, the baseline risk, it's a never smoker, never overweight or obese. So, the moderate risk category is going to be all former smokers, and all former overweight, not obese. The heavy risk category is going to be current smokers and former obese. Now, these calculations are biased against obesity specifically for the heavy risk category. Current smokers is more equivocal to current obese, the worst of the worst in both risk factors. And being formerly overweight ends up being 38% more deadly than being a former smoker, and being formerly obese ends up being 33% more deadly than being a current smoker. So this clearly shows that the risk factors from increasing risk within the risk factors of smoking and obesity, they're greatly increased in comparison to obesity, and smoking is still, again, the demon. Smoking is still considered and studied and treated as a given, presumed to be the most deadly preventable risk factor. All right, so I hope everyone can expect that I'm not going to make such a bold claim without having more data to support it. So here we go, looking at the death curve of smoking for the analysis of smoking versus obesity as a mortality risk. And so this data is a little bit older. This data is pretty extensive, very well segregated, and clear to get this age group association with smoking prevalence. So that's why I used it. I believe the data does come from like around 1995 or late 1990s. The recent data, again, this is not as readily available, if available at all. But if we look at these death curves, we can see the trends that we would expect to see. So starting with males having a lot more prevalence of smoking than females, particularly in older generations. So you see this really increase in prevalence of ever smokers by age, with younger generations smoking significantly less. When it reaches its maximum prevalence, so this looks like around the 35-year-old, 35-year-old age group. There is definitely a impact to mortality here, because if we continue the line, we'd see it should go up if it was completely independent, but we do see that there is a general downward trend. And there's not a lot of data here for because of the time of the study and the age groups, but you would expect, and it has been shown in other data, that there is a more steeper decline once once reach 60 to 65 years of age. The same exact trends can be seen with females, and luckily speaking, that last point there is also supported. So you see over here, smoking is much less prevalent, particularly in newer generations. We see that increase. There's a peak for women. It's trending around here. previously a little bit leaning towards an older peak as well, but currently peaking around 40 years of age. And so we would expect to see a decline, but there is a decline that does occur. And it appears that by some of these generations with continued life expectancy, that we see it does have a steeper decline once reaching the age of around 60 to 65. Now, when drilling into mortality associated by age group, it is going to be very important that we look at more up-to-date data. Um, and so this was a more recent study. I believe this was either 2010s or 2020. I'll provide all the references, later. But looking at, again, age standardized data in terms of 1,000 person years, you'll see that mortality risk of smoking groups does not increase dramatically. Um, at later ages. So we see that we still have it's still remaining pretty consistent compared to the baseline. And to provide support that these risk factors are truly being underestimated or misrepresented is so if we look at deaths by risk factor in the United States, you can see smoking is on the top, and it has a separate category for high blood sugar, which is tightly coupled to obesity. I know that's type 2 diabetes, but again, the general risk factor, especially since they have common causes, these are split up, whereas smoking only has one. Smoking has been declining since uh, since the 1970s and the Surgeon General's warning. And it's been declining in population, and even as the population is growing, it doesn't appear to be impacting smoking on that alone. Not to mention that smoking cessation is a lot bigger. There's a lot more programs. We've got, of course, various options in the patch and gums and other nicotine alternatives rather than direct tobacco use. We can see it too that there's a lot of other causes of mortality that saw a decrease because of improvements in health. Heart disease is one of the big ones, and yet smoking is still leveled out. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. High blood sugar and obesity as well, even though it did get close to doubling. The prevalence alone, not to mention the severity, has more than doubled like in that time, or at least gotten close to doubling in that time. So again, around 13% in 1970, currently over 40% for all of America. But yeah, all cause mortality, comparing mortality risk ratios and between smoking categories and baseline never smoked, do not properly account for the most critical health factors to longevity, such as obesity and SDI. So we do have issues there as well. Studies adjusted or determining risk factors treat obesity as a much lower risk, right? Which is going to create some inherent bias there. And again, smoking decreased significantly, obesity doubled, and yet we're still saying that smoking can hold the numbers. High blood sugar treated independently of obesity, and all these other risk factors that are associated with obesity that kind of damper the number instead of being grouped under a general obesity category. So I completely admit this is a big ballpark number, but the data suggests obesity kills upwards of 2 million Americans per year. Um, so there's around 3.4, 3.5 annual deaths a year. So that means that obesity is responsible for at least 67%, of deaths. And I do believe I detail it later, but this includes kind of like a redefinition of obesity in the case of mortality to include history of weight. Uh, so going back to its bias in current studies, when you benchmark it against smoking as a risk of mortality, it's clearly that obesity is a much higher risk factor. So with double the prevalence, We definitely, and more prevalence in terms of risk factors and correlations with cause of death as well. We really need to take that to conclude that we should see much more significant impact on mortality, from obesity as benchmarked to smoking. Uh, Presuming smoking is a risk factor accounted for correctly, and the history of obesity is shown to be more significant to all-cause mortality. Applying these factors to account for prevalence can be used to calculate some sort of minimal mortality caused by, obesity. So going back to the rate, for example, comparing the current smokers to formerly obese, that highly favors smoking as or is highly biased for smoking, or obesity as being a less, cause of risk than smoking. However, it still shows that it's 33% higher. So realistically, this category, if we look at obese, could be 40% plus. So if we take all those numbers, though, we should start wrap up some of our ballpark figures. So twice the risk, or twice the prevalence, about 30% more risk, and obesity as well has lower rates of positive change. So again, compared to being able to maintain long-term weight loss versus smoking cessation, as well as history of duration. Obesity is something that impacts children, and is positively trending with adults as early as 5 years old. Smoking is accredited with roughly 15% of all annual deaths in the United States, or about one third of the ever smoke category. So if we apply that same ratio, obesity should be presumed to have a non-biased predicted association of roughly 60% of all annual deaths. So if we take one of the big data points from the death graph of obesity, deaths less than 40 years of age with obesity as a comorbidity should be listed as obesity as the cause of death, with the events at death listed at underlying cause, right? That big sharp decline is because the people afflicted the most with that history of childhood and or morbid obesity, um, they are being killed by obesity. Deaths between 40 years of age to 84 years of age, which is the life expectancy after reaching the age of 65, with obesity as a comorbidity, should be mostly counted as a cause of death, with exception of neoplasms. So neoplasm rates, which is cancer, the general term for cancer, and is used a lot more of a term in foreign studies as well. They have less cohesion to obesity rates. You still see countries with dramatically reduced obesity rates that have cancer as a high cause of death. It also is less impacted by age group as well. So there's definitely evidence to say, hey, it's like that should be a lesser, a lesser association in the case of neoplasms. BMI of less than 30 may be a better definition of obesity to increase mortality risk, which would increase the rate of obesity as well. That's one of the questions: is how arbitrary, and a lot of how arbitrary is the definition of overweight, obese, and morbidly obese, right? Which is associated with BMIs of 25, 30, and 40, respectively. It's like, how good are those? Is it like it? Look, they obviously can't be the best numbers, and just coincidentally are all factors of five, right? That, no, that can't be. So there's also adjustments that we make in BMI according to gender. So it's something that definitely should be questioned. I do think that we should see maybe a 28 or less BMI, and history of being overweight or obese being included in the definition of obesity as well. Deaths above 85 years of age should be categorized under old age rather than historical weight or smoking as a cause of death, right? So that's going to kind of eliminate some of that preventative nature on both. I don't think, even if you have lung cancer at 90 years old, I mean, come on, smoking as a cause of death, like really, it's like like how much longer were they gonna last, right? That is a ripe old age. Not that people don't live well in their 90s, and even hundreds, especially nowadays, but still, it's like I really would classify over 84 years of age, as any real cause of death, being from old age rather than more of those direct causes. The next area of support I normally don't talk about which is evidence of intent or any type of nefarious actions or behaviors. But it is pretty important in this discussion because to accept that there are such great failures in academia, you have to suppose that there is some big reason or motivation, um, and without accepting that there is this incentive and driver from profits over public safety, that does make sense of it, and I think that does establish the how and why and details on how it has gotten this bad. That includes declining access to critical data or solutions in an age of growing technology. I want to go back and discuss Dr. Catherine M. Flagel's work directly on the matter. So she faced extreme backlash, supporting just 3% of deaths were caused by obesity. Positive trending and more isolation of obesity as a cause of death would threaten to expose relative risk of obesity. Uh, and there's still the healthy at any weight mentality normalizing obesity, and that would be proven to be deadly wrong. Um, it effectively rebuked 2004 findings through unproven theoretical adjustment weighing risk factors. So again, she did reduce it significantly from roughly 400,000 to just 112,000 over 30, over just a third of what was found in the 2004 findings. So, what would happen to Dr. Flagel's career if she had admitted bias in determining obesity's impact from pressure she has publicly disclosed, even in her work and studies past 2005? She's already getting a ton of backlash and dealing with that issues. Any nick in her armor, defending her credibility, would be detrimental, to her career. So even now, you've got to presume that she's still holding back, and she even does says in her quote, which we'll visit in a minute, that there is a lot more to her story than disclosed in the article. Key points from the quote: she was startled. As a scientist, she was startled. And she eventually came to expectations. And one of the key pieces I didn't mention before when we first visited this is what she doesn't say, right? She talks about the history of her experience and the backlash, which is still continuing to this day. She does not mention any efforts or attempts to work on this, either in this particular topic of study or in the industry as a whole. What's really being said here is that this is continuing. It's worse than anyone knows. And it is having a dramatic negative effect on the scientific quality of academia and health sciences. And it might seem a little bit left field, but in terms of evidence of intent, we do need to look at the fact there have been no contributions by artificial intelligence in health sciences. I mean, maybe there's been some little ones, but AI hasn't really solved or made anything, made some profound sort of declaration or discovery. Um, at the same time, artificial intelligence has made advances in numerous areas of study, including new discoveries on the formation of the universe, right? The secrets of the universe, analyzing data from the James Webb Space Telescope. Um, and when it comes to health sciences, AI hasn't even made any advances on some of the most long-standing, simple, debates in diet and nutrition, such as the question of what macronutrient ratio is best for what weight loss goals, or even the classic if eating eggs and increase of dietary egg intake is actually a risk factor to cardiovascular disease. These are simple and there has been no advancements. Putting aside any advancements in academia by artificial intelligence, there's also several issues just working with artificial intelligence when it comes to, obesity, weight loss, and various medical topics, right? So, artificial intelligence does not fully disclose nor provide specific details where it's drawing its information from. So, it's all trained. It's not, a lot of people may not be aware that a lot is going into the training. It's just not off in the wild determining these new things. It's specifically trained how to interpret and process information, including various ranking factors, which might include accuracy, quality, and truth. Um, and artificial intelligence restricts access to studies and data that are not publicly available. So these would be things like that would require specific purchase or subscription to access full text. Abstracts are usually available. It's like, and a lot of studies, are available on networks, but many studies, do have a cost. And artificial intelligence is trained not to disclose more information, as that would be, breaking licensing agreements. Trained information also includes sources and rankings. I already mentioned that. That may have not, but these sources and rankings may have been, measured or factored in or trained to be learned without having any direct study or proven ability that they are, the critical piece of information, that it's the right training. To demonstrate a little bit, we kind of have a scary, fun little bit here with working with AI and some specific questions that I know would trigger different responses. Um, so this is a window of Chat GPT, no endorsement or sponsorship there. Uh, but if I ask ChatGPT, hey, could you provide me a list of studies that support water fasting and very severe caloric deprivation produce long-term weight loss? It gives me this big, long warning on the health risks and dangers. It even goes so far to say that there is limited research available specifically focusing on these diet strategies. So it provides me alternative suggestions to the studies, or rather, I should say, the alternative studies on these diets besides weight loss, because apparently they're so hard to find. So here's what it gave me, right? Prolonged fasting as a method of mood enhancement in chronic pain syndromes. Okay, here's the only one that it provided for me that was relative, and it was an older 1993 study. Effects of caloric restriction and fasting on skin aging and immunity, molecular mechanisms in clinical applications. So, like, what it is basically giving me such poor results and explaining the warnings and dangers. I mean, look, like I can't separate again the fact that it gave me such crappy responses and false, like just plainly false information, and the fact that it had the warning was just coincidental. When looking specifically at the one very low calorie diet study that AI provided, the conclusion directly contradicts the warning. Here's the conclusion. Current VLCDs are generally safe when used under proper medical supervision in moderately and severely obese patients, body mass index greater than 30, and are usually effective in promoting significant short term weight loss with concomitant improvement in obesity related conditions. Long term maintenance of weight loss with VLCDs is not very satisfactory and is no better than with other forms of obesity treatment. Incorporation of behavioral therapy and physical activity in VLCD treatment seems to improve maintenance. So, it's not super supportive of VLCD either. It comes with a lot of questions. It's not very definitive, and there are many more studies, including meta-analysis studies done post 1993, showing more favorable impacts of VSCD diets, and improvement to other um, health factors as well. So it's really confusing why it's providing only one study relative to weight loss and such a poor study, and also providing warnings that contradict even its own conclusions. regarding the limited or the claim there is limited research by ChatGPT. In one of my first books on diet and nutrition, like I used a 2001 meta-analysis study. It had 29 reports, all from the United States alone, and it included 13 very low calorie diets. So there's definitely plenty of research, and that the result of that meta-analysis study concluded 5 years after completing structured weight loss programs, the average individual maintained a weight loss greater than 3 kilograms and reduced weight of greater than 3% of initial body weight after VLEDs. And if you're not familiar here, that's a very low energy diet. So it's really, again, I prefer the term VSCD, which is very severe caloric deprivation, but VSCD, VLED, and VLCDs are all equivocally the same. Anyway, after VLEDs or weight loss of greater than 20 kilograms, individuals maintain significantly more weight loss than after um, traditional weight losses or traditional weight loss diets. I forget what high HPD is again right now, but it's just essentially traditional dieting strategies. Anyway, of less than 10 kilogram results. So very, very, very favorable towards VSCDs. And numerous studies have been conducted on the short-term VSCD diets, demonstrating it is the most effective and quickest normalization of A1C and blood glucose levels as well. And here's an excerpt on one of those meta-analysis studies on VLCC diets, supporting its positive impact to type 2 diabetes and other measures for insulin and glucose control and regulation. So, conclusions: the systematic review and meta analysis have shown that both low fat vegan diets and very low calorie diets are more effective than conventional diabetes diets and non dietary therapies for reducing LDL cholesterol and inducing good glycemic control, respectively, in patients with type 2 diabetes. There is a scope for these diets to be integrated into national guidelines and for recommendations to a much greater extent, perhaps even the first line choices when individually suitable. So, in other words, high praise for the impact of very low calorie diets and VSCDs on controlling and managing factors for glycemic control and diabetes. I mean, there are a lot of reasons to suppose why AI provided me, um, the particular poor responses that it did. The information. They say an application is only as good as its data information, and clearly in health sciences there is a lot of misinformation, myth. There's a severe problem between prevalence, and number of studies and conclusions versus scientific quality and accuracy. So you could presume that AI may indeed have some issues learning in that particular area, in those areas of study. But check this out. So I asked, can you provide me a list of studies that support gradual weight loss promotes long-term weight loss? And it was happy and glad to do that, even saying it was often recommended as a more sustainable approach to achieving and maintaining a healthy weight, gladly providing me 5 studies. And there are some major concerns with its responses. ChatGPT responded with gradual weight loss is often recommended, recommended versus proven or clinically supported. Important note. Um, Recommended does not mean efficacy. Shows training to rank availability of information higher than it could to determine through data analytics, right? It is clearly evident when we start looking at the data that gradual weight loss definitely has issues and does not have the data to support that it is the better process. Um, it provided 5 relevant studies in the answer, again, compared to 4. And ironically, it had this particular study, which was done by one of the authors. It mentioned in the original response, right, when it said it didn't know of any other diets showing positive results. But this study it pulled up in a question is painting things in a positive light, or rather against very low calorie diets. It does, and it says here at the bottom to highlight. We got to look right here. Suggests that gradual approaches are more successful in maintaining weight loss over long term, right? And more successful key here too. So Wadden's conclusion in that study did not claim that gradual weight loss is better. The study concluded that VLCD diets provided no benefits. And yet, big difference between no benefits and regarding more gradual attempts. So he was comparing that to nine non-dietary therapies, but you can't draw the conclusion on success of long-term weight loss based on the fact that it didn't have a lot of significance compared to non-dietary therapy, because long-term weight loss, especially on the, depending on the amount and the duration, um, is is highly dependent on how much weight was lost initially, right? And is normally met with utter failure, regaining up to, as the entire weight loss back, in the majority of dieters, even at the 1 year and 3 year mark. So um, it's got to know that these aren't equivocal, and it can't make that conclusion. So how could AI get it that wrong? Misrepresenting it both from a failure to be able to, use data analytics in this area to make that determination, and misrepresenting the conclusion altogether. How? Why? So my day job is a software engineer, computer programmer, but I am not an AI technology expert or guru in any way. So underneath the hood, a lot of the specifics, details, and expertise, I can't say. I am familiar with it at a high level. So these are some presumptions that I can safely make, at with my current knowledge, on some of the details. So AI could get this wrong, and there's three big things I want to point out. So it could be intentional training of artificial intelligence, and it may be advised by industry experts to favor recommendations and practices under the umbrella of precaution, and that may include how it discourages practices as well. That these are safety concerns built into some of the different safety protocols. I mean, they're in place in a lot of other aspects, especially when it comes to things like discrimination and hate speech. AI, has safeguards, has some moral and ethical safeguards there. Um, so it could be intentionally learned information based on trends between scientific citations and the original published studies. So there's a lot of estimation and overpresence of studies that favor, some bigger, or could be bigger, triggers to generate profits, or different, consumer products or industries. So it's possible that it learned from seeing how scientific citations differed between the published studies and their claims, and how to recommend it to people, and how it was being effectively marketed, that it could learn to do the same thing. And so that's why we get the same behavior with AI. It also could be unintentional learning from failing to recognize scientific quality, is much less coupled with scientific consensus in health sciences, right? So I doubt its training is starting from the ground up, and without the normal rigor that establishes scientific quality in all these other industries, it may not just be like, it may need special training to prevent that, and that's just never been thought of or done, because even those in AI are still making the presumptions that it can assess quality and process data the same way in other areas of science. So um, health sciences is the only scientific field to publish more studies originated as rebuttals to inconvenient findings. And these are things, again, that should be dealt with much less weight. And health sciences is the only scientific field to not repeat studies as a practice for scientific validation, right? If you publish something in physics or astrophysics, or medicine, just in general, if you don't get the same if you aren't able to repeat the studies, then it's really tossed out, invalidated, unverified. It's like in a lot of times that independent study and repeatability is tested prior to it being published as well. It just doesn't happen though when it comes to weight loss and obesity. So to do a little bit of a litmus test on some of these theories and to discuss, to really look at, any ability for AI to rationalize, differentiate, segregate some things that are known to be more junk science in diet compared to that which is more scientifically and clinically credible. I asked AI about if eating chocolate can help reduce weight. And the reason why I asked this specific question is there was a 2015 hoax where a journalist had taken advantage of pay for play publishing and got these bunk studies that were published, and went to the extent to see how far he could spread it in news and academia, and it was widely affluent. So in general, here there's a lot to dissect in how this response is such a poor representation and clearly influenced by some of this misinformation that's been identified. Has been suggested to have some potential benefits for weight management. No, not really. Yeah, there are so many issues. I mean, yes, you could talk about satiety and other factors, but no, it's really not significant. A lot of times significant, it's like, in these secondary pieces, they don't have to stand up to the scrutiny of statistic confidence as a secondary piece. So they can make a lot of claims, and this is where it could be drawn from. And again, a lot of that was generated in part of the hoax and the hype around the debunk articles claiming some more dramatic impacts from being able to eat chocolate. The behavior and responses of AI when asked questions about obesity demonstrate the same trends to discourage inconvenient findings as is present in corporate funded America. And unfortunately, though, this is a challenge that's going to be very difficult to overcome because it would need specific training on calculating criteria such as study design and conflicts of interest to determine quality over presence to distinguish, corporate interest and bias. The ease of publishing studies failing to meet scientific standards and health science is so prevalent, it's even been studied. And so it's going to, obviously continue, and it's going to have to learn the evolving nature of those narratives. Modern AI also includes safeguards that prohibit providing direct or suggestive content that is deemed to be immoral, unethical, or unsafe. So there's a lot of issues with getting full access in these topics that are already, very hard to differentiate the scientific credibility. And if AI can't provide sources, in a lot of ways, it's no better than a blog or an article, citing claims without referencing where their claims and their sources of truth are coming from. There's also a notable trend in the availability and access to data, particularly raw or crude data, that's been declining and is particular to source as well. So it doesn't make any sense. Technology, data collection, and the availability to share data has grown leaps and bounds in the last few decades, but the availability of crude data and any unprocessed data, is again less and less available. High level conclusions are being based on higher level generalizations. So even in the presented data, sometimes it's impossible to see the data, that they based it on. Uh, and the lack of access to the raw data more as internet storage has become effectively free for a lot of these institutions, organizations, and other researchers, who are putting that data for public access or putting that out there, as supplementary facts and figures, right? So that doesn't explain why we've had a restriction, as the amount of data that we should have should be growing. And there's purposeful marketing of secondary information as controlled outcomes, right? That's also making it harder and harder, especially at the higher level social media or news or mainstream information recommendations go. I mean, it would be easy to kind of dismiss that, the significance of that, because, if less and less data is available and more information and sources are coming from articles and blogs, then, they don't have to adhere to the same level of credibility as other newsworthy sites. But this goes straight back to the major health agencies in America, such as the CDC and National Health Institute. They've been dramatically reducing data availability in their published studies, since the mid 2000s as well. So the data is just not available. It's also notable that state-funded studies often contain more data and are sources for the critical information needed for this proof and support of obesity and its true extent of mortality risk, right? So uh, also studies funded by the governments besides the United States are much more likely to have greater data availability, more control of critical variables, more concise conclusions, and more insignificant findings. So in the US, which should by all means have the most extensive research, familiarity, testing, protocols, et cetera, for discovering solutions on obesity, and the causes of the obesity epidemic, the data and the direction that it's going over the last decade is getting worse, not better, while other countries with much less history and much less impact are well above the current level of scientific quality and data availability as America is today. Here is a great example of information degradation, over time. So this death curve of obesity was something that I readily found available and was top of the list and was regularly organized. Um, you know, uh, around 2010 timeframe and before and now is getting limited more and more, typically going with age adjusted metrics. So on the right, you see how they're presenting the data of obesity rates over time, and not only uh, does it try to effectively lay out the playing field, I guess, with obesity death rate, which shows clear, apparent, and significant bias to reduce the impact of obesity, right? If all the prevalences are roughly around the same, I mean, 20-year-olds and 60-year-olds, same relative age-adjusted prevalence. I mean, come on, it's like that's clear bias to minimize the impact of obesity over time. But this is how you find the data most of the time, and you don't have in the newer studies, they don't have the links or sources for the direct data in a lot of cases. It can be found, but they are not making it easy, and there are many times where it's just not available. The true morbidity of obesity and the mortality risk from history of excess weight is absolutely one of the most inconvenient findings. The overall health, safety, and mortality, if it ever exceeds tobacco again, is highly of disinterest and is threatens corporate profits from obesity in the food, medical, pharmaceutical industries, agricultural industries, and even and more. But these are some other really big, most inconvenient, findings that we've kind of discussed or touched on today in this video. So type 2 diabetes can be reversed for a lifetime. Cannot even say cured here in as little as 2 weeks because it's illegal to say cured and it's considered to be a permanent condition. Um, but it can be reversed for a lifetime in as little as 2 weeks through water fasting or via CD diets. The promotion of this, the known studies of this, less and less available after 2000 as obesity gets more and more out of control. Type 2 diabetes is often recommended to be treated through weight loss. However, the hidden truths reveal that weight loss does not directly reduce prevalence of type 2 diabetes. That's again looking at associations by age group, and type diabetes is growing very independently by age, than obesity is. So weight loss, and weight loss recommendations are at least 5 to 10% of body mass, which takes up to 6 months to achieve. And the maintenance of 10% body weight loss is not achieved by the majority of dieters. We're talking 80, 90, 95% plus within a 1 to 5 year period. So weight loss is a horrible recommendation, and that's a primary recommendation to combat and reverse type 2 diabetes. Fasting and VSCD diets produce the best short-term and long-term weight loss, uh, and they are still being demonized, for weight loss as well, not just not mentioned like in the case of type 2 diabetes. Another item of importance to discuss, for censorship, I think most people probably aren't aware, is that discussing inconvenient findings is so restricted, it's often not allowed or quickly removed in public internet forums such as Reddit. MyFitnessPal also has a huge forum, and these public forums for diet and nutrition have set rules for posts which specifically prohibit any discussion of fasting or via CD dieting unless it is mentioned as unhealthy or dangerous. You can spit science and studies out all day that claim that, fasting or VSCD diets that have been used for centuries are super dangerous and unhealthy, especially compared to the mortality risk of obesity, right? You can say that all day, unclaimed, unscientific, unproven, doesn't help anyone. But if you suggest, hey, uh, fasting and VSCD dieting has extensive studies to support that you can reverse it for a lifetime in 2 weeks. Well, that threatens corporate profits, and so that's very, very, very inconvenient. And yeah, it's not allowed. Anytime that I've discussed it, most of the time the post is gone for an hour. You can't even talk about, well, I'd be cautious and well, I'd be safe. Those aren't guaranteed to stay either. So that is being pushed down from the very top levels that are discouraging it in academia, in sciences, and for the legal recommendations and protections, quote unquote, that these forums are doing in guidance to medical safety and medical recommendations. So it basically just cannot be discussed. And finally, at slide 72, and an hour and 40 minutes of talking points and discussion, the inconvenient conclusion. So, taking into account Dr. Flagel's personal accounts, clear evidence hidden between the lines, the decreasing availability of critical data, the failure of modern academia to account for critical variables, and an established pattern historically with tobacco and opioids, I must conclude that there is an intentional effort to hide the morbidity of obesity. And to wrap up with a bit of a summary, including recap and action items, um, I still have it ingrained in me from my military days that, talking about a problem without providing a solution is just complaining. And so in that case, I do want to focus as well on important action items. It's going to take a lot of work and effort, for any change to happen, and there's a lot more work and effort, that I have to do just to gather, the next parts of the presentations in the series. So there's a lot to be done on both sides. I'd like to first start off with an acknowledgement that it would be wonderful to dismiss the morbidity of obesity as freedom of choice, live your life the way that you want, and or in the perspective everyone has a time they are meant to go. But I cannot, and for the sake of well-being of the public, no one can ignore these hidden truths in the morbidity of obesity. The most frightening hidden truth of the worsening impacts of obesity driven by hereditary epigenetics and epigenetic influence of diet during gestation is obesity is perpetuating obesity. And so that's why childhood obesity and epigenetics and hereditary influence of obesity is going to be the next presentation. and it should be pretty extensive as well. For a quick recap of the events, as truths about tobacco use were exposed in the 1970s, the tobacco giants transitioned to food giants using improved strategy employed in their efforts to suppress the harmful effects of smoking while promoting an addictive product. They transitioned from nicotine addiction to food addiction. There's a multitude of studies providing clear evidence the mortality risk of obesity is both improperly controlled and dramatically understated. Clinical studies contain direct evidence independently and can be combined by all cause mortality risk factors. And even with this direct support, it is still being ignored in plain sight. The critical data required to identify working solutions to the obesity epidemic are less and less available without explanation, particularly as technology and availability to data is increasing year by year. So I have no clue who is sticking around to the end or watching the end of this with extensive and as overloaded as a lot of these discussion points are. Uh, but this is a call to take action. We need to make this presentation and video viral, and especially if you disagree. At least in that case, there's a hope that new data and answers will be uncovered in the criticism. uh, it's like just like the reason why backlash isn't shouldn't be conflated with scientific criticism is if you want to challenge any of this content, provide alternative theories or whatnot, that is wonderful. That is good and productive, but it has to be under scientific merit, not just because it can't be true. Um, and so at least, if there's an uproar to answer these questions or to prove me wrong, then hey, maybe we get some scientific scrutiny on everything as well, more publicly, transparent and aware. Especially, spread this, especially if you our loved ones have struggled with weight. This is going to be a lot of explanations, and hey, the more that I can continue these series, the more that I can help, and I'd be glad to do so. um because and we must remember that if we continue on current trends, it will mean millions will continue to die every year without the hope of finding even a single solution to the obesity epidemic that works. Right, we don't have any. There's nothing with scientific support that has been repeated, verified, and independently studied that of any solution to include diet, exercise, and pharmaceuticals. And with obesity rates growing out of control, particularly in the children, like, there has to be an uproar, or more and more are going to be effective and more severely. you know, I am actively encouraging everyone to share the truth and to open the discussions back on weight, as a health concern for friends, family, loved ones, and those we want to help. And the truth of the morbidity of obesity may inspire millions to lose weight and maintain healthier lifestyles. So do be blunt, but also be supportive. There's no excuse for body shaming and emotional toll. Be supportive and put it in the perspective of being concerned for someone for their health, or, and or out of love for them. Um, so belief of survival and more severe consequences, they are powerful motivators, and this applies to more than mind over matter. Long-term weight loss success requires sustainable motivation, and if you're highly motivated by consequence, that can be an effective motivator not to fall off a diet or to go back to unhealthier lifestyles. Um, we need to demand eating beyond obesity be treated and taxed as a deadly consumer product, right? I mean, with smoking as the demon, there's really no action in the food industry. And if we can get that action in the food industry, maybe that'll support the end of food fraud, and it might shift subsidies towards sustainable agriculture, improving costs of more nutritional foods and improving overall soil nutrition content. So there could be some big benefits by, just in general, exposing the truths and spreading this information. And the largest of these items of action is to demand a massive overhaul to policy and practices at the FDA. Um, and one of the articles, or one of the links that I'll have in my links to references coming up next, it does have an extensive article written by an expert and a doctor, in the fields, looking at recommendations that need to happen. For policies and practices between drugs and consumer safety, how they should be separated, organized, current issues. So, and apparently he wrote a pretty large book on the topic as well. So check out those links if you want to see what his specific recommendations are. But we definitely need to separate the responsibility of consumer safety for both food and drugs to be under medical authorities, right? Um, Switch to government paid healthcare to remove profit motives and shield doctors from the influence of unethical financial gain. If you make it illegal for doctors to report these kickbacks, and you have the medical profession under single payer care or government paid health care, and they can't get income effectively, for that is driven by corporate profits, then they don't have the incentive, and they're less likely to, again, prescribe drugs like Oxycontin just for the kickbacks they get. And hey, they know that it's going to get more and more as their patients get more and more addicted, right? That has to stop. So demand accountability for failures in the FDA when approved drugs cause unpredictably high fatalities or undocumented side effects. This happens. Someone needs to be held accountable, and something needs to change. There's no reason why we can't completely redesign our airport structure after the risk of a shoe bomb, that we can't redesign how we hold the FDA and government agencies, responsible for consumer safety causing fatalities. Like, we can bridge that gap, we can make that happen, and there's just no public demand for that at the time. Demand cause of death be more apparent and transparent with weight history, properly adjusted with a modified definition of obesity that includes a 10-year period of history of excess of greater than 25 BMI, right? So make sure that we demand that we do research into finding the true extents of weight history and the weight history of obesity on mortality. We need to start collecting this data now. Otherwise, when things get too bad, if they continue on these trends, we're not going to have the data prepared to respond to that urgency, and it could have catastrophic effects. And now I'll provide some links to the references used as sources for the data, charts, graphs, and other figures presented to date. So here's profits over people. Um, and I will go ahead and provide these in the video description, or other content, so you could easily cut and paste if you're interested. As you can see, there are numerous sources from most of the expected and credentialed authorities, such as the New England Journal of Medicine, as well as PubMed, JAMA, and other sources. We have got the morbidity of obesity section with the most data and most support, therefore most references, and even evidence of intent to back up some of the claims and numbers. So hey, I hope for anyone who was able to go through all that data information, stick it out to the end. I thank you. I thank you if you are sharing this information and spreading the word. Please, comment. Let me know your comments, concerns, questions. I'd love to do some Q&A on this topic as well. So please comment. Let me know. Keep in touch, and above all else, again, start the discussion. Demand answers. Demand scientific, accuracy and quality. We need to make these public demands, or it's going to be just like the tobacco industry, and we're not going to find out how severe the issue is for decades and decades. It's time to start demanding these things for public safety, especially for the sake of our children. And so, again, I thank you. I hope you found it informative, and I hope we start a discussion, and I hope we start getting solutions. Next one coming up specifically on the hereditary nature of epigenetics on obesity and the rises in childhood obesity. So until next time, take care.